And also, it is a fact that Pakistan's war is really with the Afghan people. It's not with the Taliban, because in Pakistani airstrikes, we haven't seen any major Taliban commander or leader targeted.
But do you think, given the magnitude of this Pakistani airstrike, given the increase in hostilities along on the Durand line, do you think Taliban will find a way to be more responsible and accountable to the Afghan people?
Support from and solidarity from the international community, exposing Pakistan's airstrikes against civilian targets and civilian populations. And to begin with, as you said, many of those were disabled.
Not many condemnations came towards Pakistan, and it's interesting that they carried out the airstrike in the holy month of Ramadan, and still majority of the Arab nations really did not do any serious talking. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, India is the only country which has sent medicines and supplies till now to Afghanistan after the airstrike.
The kind of gender apartheid that Afghan women and girls are suffering under, unfortunately. So the Taliban remains an armed non-state actor, endlessly instrumentalizing extremism and terrorism.
Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Ashraf Haidari, a seasoned diplomat and educator and the founder and president of Displaced International, an organization that works with internationally displaced people. Except today we will talk about Ashraf Haidari's homeland, that is Afghanistan. In the last few weeks, hostilities between the Taliban in Afghanistan and the Pakistani army have dramatically increased. In fact, Pakistan bombed a rehabilitation center in Kabul, killing almost 400 people. Pakistan says they bombed a drone factory. The Taliban says it was a rehabilitation center. Ashraf, which side do we believe?
I think they're two sides of the same coin. Here from the Afghan perspective, because of course the Taliban really lack any technological capacity of any sort to have established and run a drone factory. So that's a flat lie. And also it is a fact that Pakistan's war is really with the Afghan people. It's not with the Taliban, because in Pakistani airstrikes, we haven't seen any major Taliban commander or leader targeted. Unfortunately, the targets have mostly been either innocent civilians or public infrastructure of the Afghan people, much of which was actually built or rebuilt with international aid before 2021. So you have a situation in Afghanistan where the state sponsor of terrorism, in this case the Taliban, which is quite well documented, is exploiting the Taliban as a pretext to strike targets of choice across Afghanistan, basically militarily weakening Afghanistan, knowing that the Taliban is a strategic project up for rent. Not only that, Pakistan still maintains influence over the group and elements of the group through its intelligence agency, ISI, but it also some of those other elements have been rented by others in the region, notably India. And so it's in that context that Pakistan is quite upset in the context of strategic rivalry with India, as India made inroads into the Taliban, exploiting the Taliban against Pakistan. And in this process, unfortunately, the Afghan people have been victimized, both by Pakistan and as well as the Taliban. And China, or certainly now increasingly with India and the dynamics as well. So everyone is gaining something. The Taliban is getting to stay and build legitimacy. As Pakistan continues striking, Pakistan is, of course, getting much in return in terms of trying to regain any lost influence over the Taliban, threatening their leadership, threatening their command and control. That if they don't, realign with Pakistani interests, then they could be a target. And for India, it doesn't have to worry much about the line of control and the maintenance of heavy security there, because it's now increasingly and very inexpensively able to hit targets of choice in Pakistan through BLA and TTP, sheltered under the Taliban in Afghanistan. So here, the situation is lose-lose for the Afghan people, but a win-win for the rest.
Yeah, but okay, that's very interesting how you've put it. And for our global audience who are going to be watching us, I just want them to know that the Taliban were essentially formed in Pakistan with the blessings of the Pakistani army, of course, the blessings of the ISI, the Pakistan Army's intelligence wing. So Pakistan should be happy that the Taliban are back in Afghanistan, that they're running Kabul. But instead of that, instead of creating this so-called strategic depth that they've so famously talked about for the last 75 years, they've gone ahead and they continue to bomb civilians. Please help me understand this. Please make it make sense.
Well, in their mind, they have actually achieved that depth, but as we've seen over the past 4 years, the way militant groups and terrorist groups operate is that they are always transactional. So when they were based in Pakistan, the Pakistani military was firmly in their control. But once they were enabled by Pakistan to recapture Afghanistan, now the Taliban is not monolithic. There are factions within the Taliban based on ethno-tribal differences and rivalries that even date back into Afghanistan's long history, and as well as other, financial and political and power competition, rivalry, and difference, which then foreign intelligence agencies exploit. In this case, now India has been quite successful, and that has upset Pakistan as it feels that it has lost the influence that it gained to its destructive proxy, which remains sanctioned under the United Nations, illegitimate in Afghanistan, illegitimate abroad. But of course, Afghan neighbors have to pragmatically engage with them just to maintain eyes on the ground, because Afghanistan under the Taliban provides sanctuary for over a dozen regional and transnational terrorist and criminal networks, and whose focus is really some of Afghanistan's neighbors, from China and Russia to Central Asia, in even, of course, India, because we remember that it was the Taliban who attacked Indian assets in Afghanistan, the consulates and the embassy, and killed Indian diplomats and the military. So in a way, that's how India really rationalized engagement with the Taliban in kind of preemptively engaging to balance against Pakistan. So unfortunately, like I said, for the audience, that Afghanistan has more or less remained over the past 4 decades a battlefield of neighboring countries and extra-regional players, constantly balancing, constantly hedging to achieve their geopolitical and geostrategic goals. And unfortunately, the vacuum in Afghanistan is one of true dedicated leadership that has not been able to have its own voice, and has not been able to build the capacity needed to also hedge and to also balance effectively in the region and outside the region, in order to ensure stability in Afghanistan. to ensure Afghan agency of what is happening in the country.
Right. I want to talk about the airstrike that happened at the Omid camp. That's the name of the rehabilitation center for drugs. Um, Apparently, there are more than 1,000 patients who are getting treatment there. In the airstrike, at least 400 were killed. We've seen visuals of families coming to the hospital mourning over the death of their loved ones. But have they really gotten any reconciliation? Have they gotten any support from the Taliban administration or from any international organizations?
Not really. All you see is optics. Basically, the Taliban exploiting those images to build legitimacy with the Afghan people on the one hand, and to also somehow gain sympathy and support from and solidarity from the international community, exposing Pakistan's airstrikes against civilian targets and civilian populations. And to begin with, as you said, many of those were disabled or individuals impoverished and as a result addicted. These are all victims of Pakistan's decades-long terror campaign in Afghanistan. Youth who were unemployed, youth who unfortunately fled Afghanistan to Iran and Pakistan and got addicted there and came back to nothing, to no home or a job or a future. And many of those young people ended up on the streets. And then, of course, with some international assistance, they had been receiving rehab assistance. But unfortunately, they were simply bombed, and no one really has talked about it much because of the a war with Iran, which has captured, international attention in media headlines. And as a result, as I said, the Afghan people remain voiceless, and all sides are exploiting that, from the Taliban to the Pakistanis and others who compete with Pakistan and compete over, influencing and controlling the Taliban as a, strategic instrument to achieve goals of external players.
Ashraf, I want you to tell us more about the international silence on this issue. Um, and I'll give a little bit of context. Yes, the war in Iran has taken up most of the coverage. Yes, um, Arab countries are busy defending themselves and also ensuring that fuel and gas passes through the Strait of Hormuz. So yes, they're occupied. However, not many condemnations came towards Pakistan, and it's interesting that they carried out the airstrike in the holy month of Ramadan, and still, majority of the Arab nations really did not do any serious talking. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, India is the only country which has sent medicines and supplies till now to Afghanistan after the airstrike. Why is there so much international silence on this issue? I mean, why couldn't leaders just get on a call? Why couldn't the GCC get on a call and ask Pakistan to just stand down, given that there's already a raging war with Iran?
Well, not only GCC, but unfortunately the OIC, Organization of Islamic Countries. If you go on their website right now, you would see back-to-back statements of condemnation of similar attacks on civilians from Lebanon to Gaza to, of course, increasingly Iran and elsewhere, places of interest to OIC member states and whoever is the most influential, but nothing on Afghanistan.
Hmm.
And it is unfortunate and it is disappointing. It is tragic for the Afghan people to have been abandoned. And to the extent that condemnation comes from India is really to support the Taliban, not to really address the structural problem underpinning why strikes from Pakistan at the end of the day,
Mm,
in that context of rivalry with Pakistan. So that's why we don't count so much on Pakistan, but Afghan people still truly count on India for a variety of reasons. Foremost, given the civilizational ties, the deep people-to-people ties that India can still restore as much as it has lost that friendship with the Afghan people. And India is a democracy which should, stand for and defense of the UN Charter and as well as related legal instruments, international human rights and humanitarian law, and defense of Afghanistan against both the sponsor and as well as the proxy. In this case, as I pointed out, that Pakistan and the Taliban are two sides of the same coin. One heading Afghanistan directly, another, basically killing in Afghanistan indirectly, as we know from the enforcement and imposition of the gender apartheid on the Afghan people, imprisoning over half of Afghanistan's population with the direct impact on women, girls, and as well as the children that they raise. And that's why you have seen over the past 4 years and the rates of mortality from babies to children to children before the age of 5 having gone up and returned to the decimal status of the 1990s under the Taliban, which means that more Afghans are dying today under the Taliban's
mm,
rule than they were before 2021, despite the Taliban's prosecution of a daily terror campaign sponsored by Pakistan for years, which killed to the tune of 10,000 Afghans killed and maimed, which is well documented by a United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, one of their key products, really, at least since they started recording. And so you have a situation where Pakistan is now striking directly,
mm.
while, of course, undermining and destabilizing and destroying Afghanistan indirectly by maintaining the Taliban and power and continuing to compete with India over who really has full control, or at least, in this case of Pakistan, to regain any lost influence to India. So in a nutshell, again, Afghans are a victim of this dynamic, unfortunately. And we are a victim of this dynamic because of a lack of leadership. You
Mm.
have now no opposition to speak up and no resistance that's really meaningful and that has emerged over the past 4 years, which means that the space is quite open as we see daily Pakistan transgressing and violating Afghanistan's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and there is no one to really defend that.
Right. So, Ashraf, I want to ask you some tough questions regarding Taliban. Yes, they've been in power in Kabul since 2021. Um, yes, they're in power because the United States made a mess of Afghanistan. And the last time we spoke about Donald Trump wanting to retake the Bagram base, which is slightly north of Kabul. Um, but the truth is, the life of an ordinary Afghan under the Taliban is definitely not what it was like before 2021. It's a lot more dangerous, and it's definitely not a life they would want. And on top of all of this, you've got Pakistan sending back more than 2 million Afghans back into the country. They've got Pakistan bombing Afghanistan at will. The international community remains silent. Only Russia has officially recognized the Taliban administration. Of course, India did host the Taliban's foreign minister, Amir Khan Muttaqi, in New Delhi. But other than that, the world has largely been silent. Do you think this can all be prevented if Taliban is given more legitimacy?
Uh, Not necessarily. I mean, the Taliban are not changing and have not changed. They've had about 5 years since they came into power facilitated and enabled by Pakistan, and of course the Doha deal, the withdrawal of the NATO
Hmm.
prematurely enabled the Taliban to basically topple a functioning young democracy, which must have been saved and in which the Afghan people endlessly invested blood and treasure so that Americans, and we remain indebted to the American people, taxpayers, for billions of dollars that they provided to help transform Afghanistan from what it was under the Taliban to a functioning democracy, despite its flaws. And yet, the Biden and then, of course, the Trump administration, initiated Biden administration, implemented the withdrawal, effectively enabling the Taliban, with the support of Pakistan, to recapture Afghanistan, which the Afghan people really consider a colossal betrayal of
Hmm.
their embrace of democracy, equal human rights, and all the liberal universal values that even Afghan neighbors, despite some of them being authoritarian, have at least nominally embraced under international laws. And so the Taliban have not changed, and they will not change to the extent that they try to gain a recognition is not to restore anything that the Afghan people had gained in 20 years before 21. It is
Hmm.
going to be more repression, more oppression, more subjugation, more of the same. And at least look, across the region, despite the type of regimes and governments in place, women and girls go to universities and schools, they graduate, they increasingly contribute to their society, polity, and economy. Even, of course, the custodian of the holy um, sites, I mean, Saudi Arabia, we have been observing how they have opened up and increasingly empowering their women, knowing that if they wish to achieve any sustainable development and as well as sustainable peace, that it can be achieved by including women, not excluding women. So, despite repeated calls now, what Pakistan is doing or what India is doing aside, but both countries have called on the Taliban or whatever their goals that which we discussed, but
Hmm.
the Taliban have not responded to the very entities that have directly or indirectly increasingly supported them, or recognize them in case of China, or recognize them in case of Russia, or even Iran, that they are very much in bed. If you look at the status of women in Iran, it cannot by any means be compared with the kind of gender apartheid that Afghan women and girls are suffering under, unfortunately. So the Taliban remains an armed non-state actor, uh, endlessly instrumentalizing extremism and terrorism, which in a sense they're a project of strategic use to state actors in the region and beyond. And that's how those state actors are happy with the status quo under the Taliban. And that's why on and off they either directly, engage with them, or they're indirectly and clandestinely in touch with them and maintain them in power. We know about the, cash shipments that the Taliban regime receives from outside, and the artificial macroeconomic stability that is in place in Afghanistan, knowing that Afghanistan is closed for trade, commerce, and investment, and that a government that is sanctioned and not recognized financially is unable to transact in its own neighborhood, let alone the rest of the world. So, in essence, Afghanistan is a managed island of instability in a region of immense geopolitical and geostrategic importance. And it is unfortunate that it is happening to the Afghan people, in a nation that has suffered for now decades, but also they're a victim of a lack of leadership, which I pointed out that no single Afghan group has really emerged to, shed foreign influence or to reject and maintain independence, but at the same time work with interested stakeholders based on a win-win way out of the situation in Afghanistan. So the opposition remains irrelevant, divided, and without a leader, and that gives the Taliban, basically open a space for doing what they do, and as well as their principal sponsor and others who have now increasingly rented the Taliban. And I'm not just talking about India, others as well. We see, how Iranians are involved in Afghanistan, how Russia's involved, and even Central Asia. So everyone, like I said, have pragmatically engaged, and everyone is getting something in return, with the exception of the Afghan people. And in all of which, have really maintained the Taliban in power and ensured the status quo.
Okay, but do you think, given the magnitude of this Pakistani airstrike, given the increase in hostilities along on the Durand line, do you think Taliban will find a way to be more responsible and accountable to the Afghan people after this? Or do you think there's just no incentive for them to even care?
Unless they are really incentivized through carrots and sticks.
Hmm.
And if that is really forceful enough, meaningful enough for them to respond, I doubt they would change, because the status quo favors them. They know that, say, for example, if there were an inclusive, legitimate government recognized regionally and globally, that the Taliban would lose. Who's interested in the Taliban? Is there any government, any nation in the region or outside? If you talk to ordinary Indians, they reject the Taliban. If you talk to ordinary Pakistanis, they immediately reject them all. Pakistanis of all ethnicities, from Sindhis to, Punjabis to Pashtuns, unfortunately, who have been the primary victims of the Taliban, as much as they try to exploit ethnicity in the Afghan context. But it is a Taliban that have unfortunately killed, destroyed, and targeted Pashtun leadership on both sides of the Doran line than any other group in Afghanistan. Something that unfortunately in the Afghan context gets often ethnicized and politicized, and Afghans forget the fact that the Taliban by no means represent the Pashtuns, and vice versa, that Pashtuns are and have been the primary victims of this strategic project.
Ambassador Ashraf, as always, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you very much for talking to Fair Observer and for bringing these insights. And I hope to have you back again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me again.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.